There are many disturbing cases of animal abuse in our province. Unfortunately, we've seen little in the way of animal protection during this mandate of the NDP government until recently. My question to the Minister of Agriculture: what tangible and effective changes can the people of Nova Scotia expect from this government in this session?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, that's a good question. It's our plan during this session to introduce legislation that I think will tend to mirror legislation across the country in other provinces to increase penalties in particular. I think clarify some language in the present Act, and I want the member to be aware that this would be the second time in our mandate that we made adjustments to that Act. So I asked them to hold on. It'll probably be, I think, a week or two before that legislation gets introduced.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
I thank the Minister for that straightforward answer. Mr. Speaker, however, it is a shame the NDP government has not acted upon animal cruelty matters until now. Cases of abuse, puppy mills, and terrible breeding and living conditions for animals across the province have occurred while government sat idly by. And Mr. Speaker, many of the changes government can make to address these issues can be made in regulations, not in legislation. Therefore, the NDP did not have to wait for the legislative session to make changes. My question to the Minister: why has the Minister waited to make changes in legislation when the changes could have been made in regulations by the Executive Council at any time?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Yeah, I'd like the member opposite to think for a second around the issue on the broader scope. It's an animal health issue. We rely in particular on the veterinarians who work for us to advise us on legislation or regulations around animal health. We think that it's important to listen to the people who are professionally trained in this area, and to this point, in my time as Minister, which is coming on for 4 years, there's nothing that they brought to us that would indicate that there's anything that regulation would have to be tweaked. But we are doing a review of that legislation. We have some ideas of changes that we think would be significant and would mirror legislation across the country. But I want to make it clear that we really depend on information from professional veterinarians on how to go about legislation or regulation in terms of proper care for animals.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 2 days ago, we learned that the government plans to create a new department, the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development. Mr. Speaker, on a number of occasions, we've asked the Minister of Community Services. Mr. Speaker, on a number of occasions, we've asked the Minister of Community Services, who used to be responsible for childcare, to clarify statements she made with regard to funding for childcare centres. And at best, Mr. Speaker, she's been inconsistent. So my question will be for the Minister of Education. Will the Minister tell members of this House what plans her government has for the funding model for childcare centres in Nova Scotia?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very pleased to stand here today representing the early years component of the work that this government does. It is very important that every child in this province has the opportunity to reach their potential. So this government is making sure that we're looking at education and child development from zero, from birth, right straight through to their years of schooling. So I'm very proud to be able to say that we will be talking about these initiatives in the coming weeks, and I'm very proud that at this time that I'm representing education and early childhood development, and so I look forward to being able to discuss this.
Order, please. The time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers is ended. I will now recognize the Honourable Government House Leader to call business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, please call, address, and reply to the speech from the throne.
Address and reply speech from the throne. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise and continue my address to the speech from the throne, Mr. Speaker. It's been interesting reading over the last few days to have an opportunity to truly assess what's been put before this House as really a political document, an election platform. But I think to be fair to the government, there were a few things inside of this document which provides a little bit of I think, encouragement from and comfort for Nova Scotians. I know just recently at the question period, we talked about the early childhood development, Mr. Speaker, the announcement that that was going to become and be developed inside the Department of Education. Well, let me tell you, this caucus fully supports and believes that we have as a province need to develop an early childhood education development program to give every child the opportunity to be able to succeed as they go from birth and move through towards, Mr. Speaker, their journey through public education. I hope as part of that there will be early screening, early assessment, so that we can identify any challenges that may be there for young Nova Scotians, and that we can provide some supports around not just that young Nova Scotian, but, Mr. Speaker, around the family of that young individual to be able to provide the supports that are required, not only to allow that young person to move beyond the challenges they may face, but also provide the family with the supports that are going to be required, Mr. Speaker, to help that development as it continues to go. But, Mr. Speaker, I will send a note of caution. We have seen what this government has done to the P-12 education part of that department with drastic cuts. $65 million, Mr. Speaker. We during question period today, we heard of just what the increase in electricity by itself has caused for the boards across the province. So, Mr. Speaker, you can imagine if all of a sudden one of your largest budget items is allowed to continue to go out of control at a rate of 30%, and government's not there to backfill that revenue. It has to come from somewhere. And boards are left in a very difficult position of having to make tough choices. Whether they provide librarian service, do they provide supports in the classroom to teachers? And I can tell you, as I travel the province and get an opportunity to talk to parents and students, teachers, Madam Speaker, they are feeling that crunch now. It's evident in classrooms across the province. And, you know, any economist will tell you that the last place, no matter how bad the economic situation is, the last place you should be cutting from to balance your books is from your education system. It is the key, quite frankly, for our collective future, that we ensure that every child gets an opportunity to reach his or her full potential. And yes, I agree with the government. That doesn't start at primary. That starts at birth. And we need to make sure that as we build the early development program, that we are providing supports not only for that young person who may require it, but also for the family. But we can't do that at the expense of public education and continue down the road of cuts and more cuts, Madam Speaker. And this particularly when we're allowing the boards to have to suffer through the inflationary costs of all of the other parts of their budget that traditionally governments have always been there to support and backfill. Mr. Speaker, one other aspect of this, a couple of other aspects of this budget which in the announcement were short on detail, and that was the rural transportation strategy. Madam Speaker, that is also a positive thing on the surface. We need to, though, make sure that the details in and around that rural transportation strategy and what they look like. I know there's been amazing work done in and around Clare with Clarendon Robichaud, who's been a tremendous work with transportation to Clare. and other communities. The member from Richmond talked about today that their service is actually being closed because of inability to be able to deliver that, and I want to thank the minister who's responsible for that, the Minister of Municipal Relations, who has agreed to sit down with the community and see if there's a way forward to provide a solution. But we need to look at how do we enhance that. And for every rural Nova Scotian who requires some transportation assistance, the answer and solution sometimes varies and is different. So I hope as the details start showing up of what this strategy will look like, that we get a chance, that community has a real chance to have input. And one of the great things about this province, I mentioned Clarendon and Robichaud, and there's others across the province who have an expertise in delivering transportation to rural Nova Scotians. I would encourage the government to rely on that expertise, bring them in to be able to help them formulate this policy and development as it goes forward. It's one thing to say it in the budget or in the speech, or thrown from the speech, is quite another on what the details of that look like, Mr. Speaker. And I would be remiss if I didn't add this piece, and that is, it is a real issue in rural Nova Scotia in terms of some transportation, but let's not ignore the fact it is in many parts of HRM as well. We need to make sure that when we do a assisted transportation strategy, that we do so in looking at the entire provinces. While the delivery model may be different depending on where you live, the need is still the same, and we need to make sure that we work towards that. The other most important, one of the announcements that I was quite encouraged by was the housing strategy. And I know the minister referenced the housing strategy earlier, and I must say, I'm looking forward to that strategy being released, because, Madam Speaker, I think it is the single most important thing that we can do, particularly for low-income Nova Scotians who are struggling under the burden of daily living, that we provide them with an affordable housing program. And it's been said many times. I've said it publicly. I'll put it on record here. Only through the grace of God, my parents bought a house before my father passed away. Otherwise, I don't know what my mother would have done with all of us and not owning a home. We were fortunate to be able to have a roof over our head, one that she could close the doors and lock them at night and make sure that we were all where we were supposed to be and put her head down. I can't imagine what her life would have been like without that property, without that house, without her ability to be able to rest those precious few hours that she might have gotten in the evening when 13 kids running around. I don't know what her life would have been like. And there are Nova Scotians, Madam Speaker, who are struggling every day under the same situation with the lack of either home ownership or the lack of affordable housing in all of its forms. And I know that all members of this House, regardless of which constituency they represent, understand and identify the fact that there are many different needs of housing. There is we need an affordable way for home ownership. We need affordable rental situations. We also need shelter, Madam Speaker, for those Nova Scotians who just may need an opportunity to find their way in out of the cold, find their way in out of inclement weather, needing a place where they can put their head down at night to find a way to rest. Madam Speaker, these are a few of the things that I felt that were in the speech from the throne that were actually positive. But I want to ring a note of caution around them, because, Madam Speaker, it's really the detail that's going to matter for Nova Scotians. The slogans are one thing, what we say is another, but it's the delivery model that will really matter to Nova Scotians. And this government has a history, Madam Speaker, of having slogans, having a big announcement, and then when you dig into the detail of it, it's a very different looking scenario. I mean, just yesterday, the Minister of Finance talked about the reduction of the small business tax, but they forgot to mention until quite later in the day that they also lowered the threshold to bump some of those businesses out into a much higher tax bracket, Madam Speaker. So it is important that as we move down the road of developing some of these strategies and getting them off the paper into practice, in reality, it's important that we recognize that we have people inside of our communities who are a great resource, who could be part of helping develop those strategies as we go forward. Madam Speaker, I don't want to talk all positive about the speech from the throne. There's a few things that I think it's important that Nova Scotians know about. But I will say, Madam Speaker, Nova Scotians are watching what this government said a few days ago. They're watching to see really the implementation and what it's going to mean. They're watching to see if, quite frankly, they've learned anything over the last 4 years. And they're watching to see if they're going to turn their words into real action and real meaningful results. And so are we. Madam Speaker, as we know, over the last 4 years, we've added $1.4 billion to the debt of the province of Nova Scotia. Madam Speaker, that's 10% of our collective debt since Confederation. 10% of our collective debt has been added to the books of this province under the NDP in 4 short years.
He was proud of his record. Did you say that earlier?
And when I talk about
what's the total revenues today?
when I talk about the
4.5 billion, 9 billion. You're still adding.
Madam Speaker, I'm hearing all kinds of stuff in the chamber. The justification of increasing the debt or breaking promises is something that they're reaching back to the 1990s. Madam Speaker, I'm going to tell you, Nova Scotians are living in today, and they got real challenges facing them. I would suggest the government move in to today. Madam Speaker, Nova Scotians are being crushed, quite frankly, by electricity prices. They're being crushed by the fact that this government increased 1,400 user fees. But Madam Speaker, as if that wasn't bad enough, today they tabled in this House increases to 1,400 user fees, but at a much larger rate than they did the previous time. I just think about this. All of the members of this House have people coming into their constituency offices struggling to meet their daily needs, pay their power bills. And what does this government do? Instead of helping, finds a way deeper into their pockets. That's not going to help us move our province forward. That's not an economic development strategy. Madam Speaker, you know, when you look at the fact that when we looked at the Industrial Expansion Fund, you know, and as this government was, we have been very critical of the way that fund has been used. This government boasted about the fact that it moved from the Industrial Expansion Fund, they renamed it. They actually changed something too. They should call it the corporate handout checkbook, because all they've seemed to do is the larger the number, they'll accept it, they write the check. You know, we have for 6 companies, we have written checks for almost $590 million, almost $600 million. And there's 1,300 fewer Nova Scotians working for those companies today. Just think about that. 1,300 fewer Nova Scotians working for those companies after we have given them almost $600 million.
Shame.
Under any other circumstances, no one would even consider that a good investment. You know, if they were in opposition, they'd be railing away at that. Imagine what they would say if either one of us had written a $260 million grant to Irving. Imagine what they would have said to that. $260 million grant to Irving. I wonder he probably wouldn't have been able to make the bottom line if we hadn't given him the money. And what was interesting is how over the last year, the government said it was an important aspect of winning the ship's contract. It was an important part of that. Well, Madam Speaker, we just discovered it had nothing to do with it. It was an absolute gift. It was an absolute gift by this government to the Irving family. That's what it was. No one's being employed by that. No, it's not. Didn't help them win the contract nationally. Didn't help them win the contract. Madam Speaker, it didn't. Madam Speaker, even the Irvings will tell you it didn't help them, Madam Speaker. Even the Irvings will tell you, Madam Speaker. Even the Irvings will tell you, Madam Speaker, but I'll tell you what, I bet they did I'm pretty sure they would have said, I'm pretty sure they would have said thank you. I'm sure they would have said thanks for writing. It was interesting. It was interesting, Madam Speaker.
Order, please.
There's a lot of noise.
There's a little bit too much chatter in the chamber. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition has the floor.
Madam Speaker, there's a lot of noise in the backbenches of that government. Maybe they're upset that the Premier overlooked them and left somebody who's retiring in cabinet over them, Madam Speaker. That's going to be a great story to have to. That's going to be a great story to have to tell. That's going to be a great story they have to tell their constituents, Madam Speaker. That's going to have to tell them a great story, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, when you look at that, though, when you look at the amount of revenue that we have spent out to lay off Nova Scotians, no wonder there are 6,400 fewer Nova Scotians working today. You know what's really interesting? What's really interesting, Madam Speaker, there are actually fewer people working today than in the height of the recession. Let me say that again in case they didn't hear it. There are fewer people working today than in the height of the recession. I want you to think about that for a sec. And we have given away hundreds of millions of dollars free, and yet we haven't created the jobs that should have been associated. Not a single job guarantee associated to any of that money we've given out. Not a single protection for Nova Scotia workers, Madam Speaker. Here's your check, cash it, and we hope that maybe you'll create some employment in the province of Nova Scotia. Well, Madam Speaker, that's not good enough. That's not good enough for Nova Scotians. You know, as I travel this province and I meet entrepreneurs from one end of this province to the other, people who are working 2, 3, 4, 5-person businesses, who are struggling to keep their businesses afloat, who are working as part of building a community, who really see their employees as more than employees. They see them as members of their community. They see them as their soccer coaches of their kids, or Sunday school teachers. They see them as individuals who are trying to build a community with like-minded people. And the last thing they want to do is lay off one of those employees. But you know the frustration they feel when they see their government take their hard-earned tax dollars and just give it away. And they say, well, wait a second, what about us? What about my grandparents and my parents who started these businesses in some cases, who have weathered through tough economic times before and have been here through it all? What about us? Why aren't you betting on us? Why aren't you supporting us? Why aren't you supporting us to help grow the economy across this province instead of looking for someone else? You know, Madam Speaker, they're saying the only thing that we seem to be receiving are fee increases or tax hikes. And fee is just another way for tax now that we've seen what is happening under this government. But you know, they see with 2% increase in HST, 1,400 user fees have gone up twice now in the last 4 years. On top of that, we've added $1.4 billion to the debt, province of Nova Scotia. We've cut funding from classrooms that their children are in. Power rates are increasing at 30%. No wonder Nova Scotians are frustrated. No wonder Nova Scotians are saying, hey, wait a second, what about us? When they see their government write these large corporate checks with no job guarantees and no commitment to the people of this province. Madam Speaker, power has been quite a topic in this province. You may have noticed a commercial that I've been in recently, Madam Speaker. It is one of quite interest, and I've been really pleased with the response of Nova Scotians around it. I've been really encouraged. I think you did. I think you did, Leonard. I think you did. I think you did. Madam.
Order, please. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Speaker, to the member from Halifax, Little Sable Island, I think I was referring to the ad that he did, but I will remind him that the ads that I've done, we've actually raised the money. Maybe he ought to try doing some fundraising. What happens? It happens. And anyway, Madam Speaker, to my point, Madam Speaker, Madam Speaker, the challenge for those members is they can't stand it when someone does the right thing, Madam Speaker. They can't stand it when someone does the right thing. They can't stand it when someone actually stands up and tells the truth. That's the unfortunate aspect of that group, Madam Speaker. They had an opportunity, Madam Speaker, to govern, and they've squandered it. And instead of running on their own record, they're now beginning to make up stuff that Nova Scotians have stopped buying, quite frankly. Because Nova Scotians bought it in June of 2009, Madam Speaker. They bought it in June of 2009, but you know what? They said no thanks this time around, Madam Speaker. But Madam Speaker, Nova Scotians have been looking at the challenges that are being faced with by the actual energy crunch that they're feeling. And never in the history before of our province has a government been so tied together with the monopoly in Nova Scotia Power than we have right now. It's so bad today, Madam Speaker, that we have the Minister of Energy traipsing around the province promoting Nova Scotia Power, thinking Nova Scotia Power should be the only game in town, thinking Nova Scotia Power should have the right to run roughshod over the ratepayers in this province. Well, we don't share that view that the member does. And it's why, if the member from Halifax Sable knew anything about it, he would know that his government is actually buying power from Hydro-Quebec as he's sitting there talking. But Madam Speaker, he's also the same minister who thought the government was going to fall when it's in a majority state, and he's a political science professor, Madam Speaker. So that explains a great deal. But Madam Speaker, you know, when you look at what's being talked about by the utility around the Muskrat Falls project, one of the things that we ratepayers are seeing is that the utility, Emera and Nova Scotia Power, can go to their shareholders. They can tell them exactly how much profit they're going to make over the life of this contract. They can tell them that Nova Scotia ratepayers are going to pay for this maritime link for 35 years. They can tell them that at the end of that 35 years, we're going to give it back to Newfoundland and Labrador with no commitment to the energy that comes through it. We'll have to buy it like everyone else. We'll be stuck to buy it, unfortunately. And yet, Madam Speaker, they can do all of that. They can do everything that, but they can't tell Nova Scotians how much it's going to mean to their power bill. So it's going to mean to their power bill. You know? No, it's rather interesting, Madam Speaker.
Order, please. There are far too many side conversations going on. If you have a conversation with a colleague, take it outside. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition has the floor. It's becoming difficult to hear. Everyone's doing it. Enough.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. When we look at what's, we can tell our shareholders, they can tell their shareholders exactly what this project's going to mean to their stock price, what it'll mean to the company's bottom line over the life of this 35-year deal. And yet, we can't tell Nova Scotia ratepayers what it's going to mean to their power bill. We have to wait until 2017. Just think about this for a second. We're going to sign a 35-year deal. We're going to commit to it without ever knowing what the real cost is to ratepayers till 2 years after we're into the deal. It doesn't make any sense, Madam Speaker, no matter how you look at it. Now, we can disagree, perhaps, of how we should deliver a mixture of energy to the province, but I don't think anyone thinks it's reasonable for the ratepayers of this province to sign an agreement that they won't know what it means to their power bills for 2 years after they've signed it. That would be like you buying a house, and 2 years later they're telling you, oh, by the way, this is how much you paid for it. Doesn't make any sense. And yet we got a government going around the province promoting it as the best possible deal. How is that the case? How is that the case? What we have said is let's look at all of the options. Let's do a true analysis of the Muskrat Falls, and let's not sign a single thing until we get an opportunity to find out what the cost will mean to the power bills of ordinary Nova Scotians. Let's give the utility reviewer the time that they require to analyze this project, and also give them the ability and time to look at other options. Buying power from New Brunswick, investing in our own Bay of Fundy in an aggressive way to harness our own energy, using some of our natural gas to blend the mix, looking at the... Madam Speaker, I'm sure if they behave themselves, the Premier will let them stand up at some point to talk. But, you know, Madam Speaker, the fact of it is, this is a 35-year deal. And I've heard members of the government, talk about Newfoundland signing an agreement with Quebec. Madam Speaker, they signed a long-term deal that they didn't know enough about. That's what happened to the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. And you know what? This government is going down the same road with Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker. This government is going down the same road, but the difference is we're the Newfoundland and Labrador in this deal, Madam Speaker. We're the ones that are getting the wool pulled over our eyes. We're the ones taking all the risk, Madam Speaker. And it is Newfoundland and Labrador that will be rewarded, and it will be the shareholders of Emera who will be rewarded for that, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, we talked about, Madam Speaker, they talked about the three-legged stool of revenue, increasing the revenues, and they certainly did that. We've seen that with the HST increase. We've seen it with 1,400 user fees. After saying, Madam Speaker, they weren't going to do that, Madam Speaker, the one stool that they're having a real problem with is economic growth. Is economic growth. Under this government, we have the worst performing economy in the country. We have fewer Nova Scotians working today than in the height of the recession. In the height of the recession, there are fewer Nova Scotians working today. You know, so
Get up and say it.
yeah, we have fewer Nova Scotians, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the Minister of Finance is having a problem. Let me reiterate that. Fewer Nova Scotia workings today. Madam.
Get up and say it. Get up and say it.
Madam Speaker, I will be more than happy to have Nova Scotians judge me on how truthful I've been with them compared to that government. You remember, Madam Speaker. You remember, Madam Speaker. You remember, Madam Speaker, no tax increases. You remember that, no tax increases. Balanced budgets. You remember that. Remember that prepayment stuff? Remember that prepayment stuff? How bad that prepayment stuff was? Well, wait till tonight or tomorrow. Wait till tonight or tomorrow to find out the next big prepayment that's going to happen, Madam Speaker, as we head into the next fiscal year. You remember, this is a government that says one thing in opposition and does something very different. This is a government that tried to hold everyone else to a different standard than themselves. The good news is, Madam Speaker, is that Nova Scotians are catching on to the behavior of this government. Madam Speaker, I want to go back to where I was talking about the worst performing economy in the country, Madam Speaker. Fewer Nova Scotians working today than in the height of the recession. You know, I want you to think about that, Madam Speaker. Recession, how difficult that was on all of our provinces, on the country. And yet, this government had done something that no other government could do. They have fewer people working now than when we were in the height of the recession. It's unbelievable, Madam Speaker. And what did they do? Turned around and increased the HST. What did they do after those 6,400 Nova Scotians lost their jobs and many others are struggling under the escalating power costs associated under this party? What did they do? What did they do? They raised 1,400 user fees, not once, but twice, Madam Speaker. So it wasn't bad enough that Nova Scotians are struggling because they're afraid to take on the Nova Scotia Power. It's not bad enough that they're struggling under the pressures of the utility. It's not bad enough, Madam Speaker, that they're struggling to keep their jobs working. It's not bad enough, Madam Speaker. It's not bad enough, Madam Speaker, that that under this government, Nova Scotians are being hit in every corner. What do? They turn around and dig into their pockets one more time, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, you know, it's an interesting. When I think about it, I don't know if I mentioned earlier that the debt of the province has grown by $1.4 billion under this government.
How much is that?
That's 10% of our collective debt, 10%. Madam Speaker.
How many years?
In 4 years. In 4 years, Madam Speaker. You know, no tax increases. You wouldn't have to that. You remember that? And what are we getting for that money? More Nova Scotians unemployed. That's what we're getting. What are we getting for that money? We're betting on someone else to come in and solve the challenges with our economy instead of working and betting on hard-working Nova Scotians. What are we getting for that money? Reduction in public education funding. Kids are being punished, being forced fewer resources in the classroom. Communities across this province are struggling. And what do they get from this government? Big checks to big companies. Madam Speaker, corporate welfare. Give it away. Let them have it. Madam Speaker, the fact of the matter is, it's interesting to hear the Minister of Fisheries talking about being against jobs. Nova Scotians would like to see a few more jobs in the province of Nova Scotia. When they're spending their money, they expect to see some results. What we have is $600 million and 1,300 fewer Nova Scotians working for 6 companies alone, Madam Speaker. The member would remember the big jobs he's been promised down in the agriculture community, his community. We're still waiting for them to appear. We're still waiting for them to appear, Madam Speaker. We know what happens, Madam Speaker. They write the check, they give it away without any commitment or job guarantee to the people of the province of Nova Scotia. That's the worst performance of any government in the history of this province when it comes to economic development, and it's the worst performance of any government in the history of this province when it comes to corporate welfare, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, there's no question. They don't have to ask me. They can cross the province. They can ask Nova Scotians. They can ask Nova Scotians, Madam Speaker. They can ask Nova Scotians, Madam Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hear the member from Hammonds Plains, Upper Sackville in the background. I suggested to him that if he behaved himself, he might get an opportunity to stand on his feet at some other point. The Premier might. They saw the opportunity. Irving saw an opportunity. Irving saw an opportunity to come in, and they landed, and they grabbed what they could. Free money, Madam Speaker, let me tell you that. And the guys that they couldn't win the contract, although we know that's not the case. They could have won the contract, Madam Speaker. We know that. And there's no reason why this government could have looked to have that money repaid to the people of the province of Nova Scotia. Madam Speaker, what time do I have? 1 month? So, Madam Speaker, I do want to also talk about the issue that was brought up by the member from the Eastern Shore. I want to talk about the issue. I want to talk about the issue that was brought up by the member from Eastern Shore around the forest industry, and it's obviously, as you know, in southwestern Nova Scotia, it's becoming a big issue, a big concern around what is the future going to be for those lands that we have paid a substantial price for, and how are we going to use those. And there's the issue around this community forest concept. And it is worrisome, to say the least, on some members of the community of what potentially may happen. I think it's important that as we do this, and I know the member from, and I would encourage all members of government, all members of the government, to actually pay attention to the member from Eastern Shore, who has a depth of knowledge when it comes to the forest sector that I think surpasses probably our collective knowledge in this House. But they have wrote, Madam Speaker, the issue for many private sector woodlot owners, Madam Speaker, is what is this strategy going to look like? What is it going to mean to the market? Is it going to depress prices? You know, in southwestern Nova Scotia, like indeed all Nova Scotia, there are mixed-use farms. There are people who work outside of their land and use their forests as a way to provide some additional income to their family. They cut a few load of logs, they sell them. They're concerned about this massive amount of public lands and what potentially could become a place for a lot of mills to get low stumpage, quite frankly, and a way to harvest more of their product without actually having to buy it from the private woodlot owners, Madam Speaker, and that is a real concern. And I would encourage the member from Citadel Sable Island to stop talking and listen to the member from Eastern Shore. Because I'm telling you, Madam Speaker, it is a real concern, Madam Speaker. It is a case of, it's one more indication, Madam Speaker, of what potentially will erode rural Nova Scotia. We need to be very mindful of the unintended consequences of the decision. Government has bought the land. It's there. Now what's going to happen with it? And let's not engage the citizens in a charade. Let's be open and listen to what ideas they may have. And it is a real concern. It is a real concern to private woodlot owners in southwestern Nova Scotia, and I would dare say across the province, that this land does not become low stumpage, which depresses the private sector market. Madam Speaker, because I'll tell you, there are many families, there are many mixed farms, quite frankly, that rely on that income, require that income to feed their families and keep them afloat. So it is critical that whatever decision is made around that is done in the best interest of all Nova Scotians, and it's done with the idea that that resource needs to be there for the long haul, and we need to make sure that that resource is not harvested in a way that it will depress private sector prices and force private sector landowners, Madam Speaker, to look for work elsewhere because they can't sell their product here in the province of Nova Scotia. Madam Speaker, it is important that as we move forward, that this government takes its time around those community forests, and for God's sakes, don't do any more damage to the rural economy than they've already done. Madam Speaker, I know the government is, the members of the government are quite exercised by the fact that they're getting an opportunity to hear what I've been hearing from Nova Scotians, the frustration that they've been feeling from this government, the frustration, the disappointment, quite frankly, the anger they felt over, this government saying one thing when they've been heading into an election campaign and doing the exact opposite. It's been, and I can tell you, as you travel the province, Nova Scotians are quick to point out that this is not what they thought they were getting in 2009. This is not the government they thought they would get. And really what I think highlighted and undermined it, Madam Speaker, was the reaction of the government yesterday around questioning around the $27 million. And it's saying it's not no big deal. It's only $27 million. It's a big deal. It's 211, 238 million deficit. It's no big deal. Shrug their shoulders. Well, Madam Speaker, it's actually a big deal. It's actually a big deal to Nova Scotians, Madam Speaker. It's actually a big deal to Nova Scotians. You know, they're struggling, and the government shrugs its shoulders. But what's even more galling, Madam Speaker, is the fact that we knew and we now know that the Minister of Finance stood in his place in this House and delivered a budget that he knew was wrong. He knew the numbers were inaccurate. And we now know the Premier knew. You know, so we now know that they stood in their place, and we now know that they knew that the budget they were tabling was wrong. And, you know, I don't think it's too much to ask, and I don't think Nova Scotians think it's too much to ask, that you deliver on the facts that you have. And the government knew that there was a $27 million error in their budget. But the problem with revealing that $27 million error was it meant that they would have had to actually then say they weren't on track. So it really wasn't about being upfront with Nova Scotians. It really wasn't about laying out the proposal, the ideas, the facts that they have. It was about trying to meet their storyline. It was more important that they met their storyline than it was about being upfront with Nova Scotians. And Madam Speaker, as the days unfold between now and next Thursday, we're going to see more of it. I bet, Madam Speaker, we're going to find out how much they're going to be able to offload to last year, to balloon the deficit to whatever it may be. I mean, they didn't care if there's a difference between 211, 238, so I'm sure they'll pick another number that's a bit higher than that and offload some expenses and be able to then try to convince Nova Scotians that they've balanced the books. Madam Speaker, I don't believe Nova Scotians will be fooled. They didn't accept it when the previous Tory government tried it, and I don't believe they'll accept it under the NDP government. Do you want me to adjourn debate? Madam Speaker, what they want from their government, and they want the government to be open and frank and honest with them. Nova Scotians are prepared to do their part. They've done it for generations. They're prepared to do what's required to move this province forward. But they can't do it when the government is not being forthright with them. They can't do it when the Minister of Finance would stand in this House and deliver a document that's inaccurate, and he knew it was inaccurate. They can't do it when their government is betting on someone else from outside of our province instead of investing in Nova Scotia. Madam Speaker, we look forward to next Thursday when this budget is going to be introduced, but you know what's going to be interesting is the stories that come out before then, before Monday. So we know the offloading of a number of expenses. We'll see how much universities are going to receive early, or maybe it's another large chunk of cash they want to offload. Just like they told us they weren't going to raise the user fees, Madam Speaker, but not only did they do it once, they did it twice. And they enjoyed it so much last time, they increased them more this time. So that's right. But Madam Speaker, we look forward to the opportunity. No, I'm like most Nova Scotians, Madam Speaker. I'm living in today, and maybe if the government start living in today, they might actually be doing a better job than they are now. Madam Speaker, maybe rural communities would have doctors. Maybe rural communities would have doctors. Maybe the emergency rooms wouldn't have closed 17,000 hours under the watch of this government, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, maybe six emergency rooms wouldn't have been closed. I'm just saying, Mr. Speaker. That's the reality of today. That's the reality Nova Scotians have to deal with this government. If they want to live in the past, I encourage the Nova Scotians are suffering today, and they might want to try to do something to accept the responsibility they were given in 2009 and do their job. Thank you very much. I'll take my place.
Thank you. Order, please. Perhaps before we move to the next member to speak, we can ask everyone to take a deep breath. We're only into day 2. It's becoming increasingly difficult to hear the member speaking, and I'd ask that, sorry, day 2 of debate. Day 3, yeah, you're right, sorry. Okay, the honourable leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Madam Speaker, and I'm glad you had everyone take a deep breath, because I know how much they're going to want to listen carefully to what I have to say. It is my pleasure, Madam Speaker, to rise and reply to the speech from the throne. something that is becoming an annual event here in this House. Speeches from the throne traditionally have been less frequent, but with the NDP, it's every year. And we can see why, Madam Speaker, because each year they have felt the need to press the reset button on their record and hope Nova Scotians will forget everything that came before and start all over again. Kind of like the Dallas dream sequence, Madam Speaker, which some members will remember, where one of the lead characters on Dallas was killed off one year, but that didn't go over very well with the viewers, so they made up a scene where that had all been a dream, so they could start all over again. That's exactly what's happening here today, Madam Speaker. Is just like that bad dream in that Dallas season so many years ago. The NDP are hoping that with yet another annual throne speech that we'll all think the previous year had just been a bad dream and they'll get a whole new season. Well, Madam Speaker, we'll see. We'll see how often that works, Madam Speaker. But we do have a throne speech. We have a whole new throne speech again. And there are a few things that I do want to talk about just right off the top that I agree with. For example, Madam Speaker, I was very pleased to see in the throne speech that the government intends to set aside a day in Nova Scotia to remember those who've been lost at sea. Very important part of the economic development of our province, the risks that people have taken in the past and the present and will again in the future to make a living for their families, to build up their communities, primarily rural communities, fishing communities. And how appropriate now when we have such a recent reminder of the dangers that many of our fellow Nova Scotians face every year as they go to sea and fish and make a living. The community of Woods Harbor had a very tragic reminder, as the throne speech notes, when we lost Caitlin Nickerson, Billy Jack Hatfield, Joel Hopkins, Stephen Cole, and Tyson Townsend. Madam Speaker, having gone through that together just in the last month, one of the things that struck me was that that was not just a loss for the community of Woods Harbor, that all Nova Scotians felt that loss. And in fact, there were memorial services and benefits and fundraisers across the province in places like Pictou and here in the capital in Halifax. I attended one myself, as I'm sure many members did, as we all shared in the grief of that community and those families, and we all understood, because we're fellow Nova Scotians, the risks that are run to earn a living in our fishing communities. In my own riding of Cumberland South, we have a number of fishing communities, Advocate Harbour, along the Parsborough shore. And I haven't done a count, but I bet you many, many members of this House represent constituencies where there are fishing communities. And so we share in that loss together. And for that reason, I believe it's appropriate that we set aside a day every year where we remember the hundreds of Nova Scotians through the generations who go to sea to earn a living. It's an important part of our history and our present and our future. Madam Speaker, while we're on the topic of the past year and the human loss that we suffer together as a province, I do just want to take a moment and recognize a few of the Nova Scotians that we all lost that are mentioned in the throne speech that I knew personally, starting with our 29th Lieutenant Governor, Mr. John James Kinley, who I had the pleasure of meeting, and whose family I know, a family that has done so much, not only for their home community in Lunenburg, but through public service and through charitable works for our whole province. And so we, of course, pause at times like this and we remember the loss of the Kinley family this year, and a loss that we all share because Nova Scotians lost a great contributor to the public life of our province. I'd also like to just pause for a moment, Madam Speaker, and recognize the loss of Raylene Rankin from the Rankin family. I grew up with the Rankin family. I know many members here are fans of the music of the Rankin family. I know that we all consider it a little bit a part of ourselves when we hear the Rankin family on the radio or we hear their music played around our province and, in fact, around the world. Their success shows that we do have a unique Nova Scotian cultural identity. Very impressively captured in Mabou, an area in Inverness, but also in other places, that has value, that has meaning, that is an industry unto itself, a cultural industry, that not only people here in Nova Scotia value and want to hear and see, but people around the world are willing to pay, buy a ticket, buy a CD, hear them in concert. Madam Speaker, the Rankins set a whole new standard of spreading the Nova Scotia culture, particularly musical tradition, around the world. And Raylene, who people that know her know, was a wonderful person as well as a gifted musician, know the loss that we all feel, not just the Rankin family, not just the people of Mabou or Inverness, but all Nova Scotians share in that loss, and that's one of the things that makes us a great province. No matter where you were born, no matter where you come from in the world, no matter what your background is, no matter what station in life you started off in or have aspired to be in, that when we lose Nova Scotians like those fishermen and like Raylene, that we all feel that loss. Madam Speaker, Ruth Goldblum falls into that category. Another Nova Scotian that I had the great privilege of knowing and calling a friend for over 20 years. Her signature accomplishment, of course, is Pier 21, now known as Canada's National Museum of Immigration. And we all know how tirelessly Ruth Goldblum worked to make that happen. We all know it wouldn't be there today without the work of Ruth Goldblum and the team that she put together. What we may not ever know in total, what we may not ever be able to add up in total, was all of the other things that Ruth Goldblum did for our province. All of the charities, all of the causes, all of the stitching of our social fabric that she did behind the scenes. You can count it in the hundreds and hundreds of different gifts of time and fundraising to make this province a better place. And so I say that, Madam Speaker, because certainly her roots were in Cape Breton, and the people of Cape Breton feel that loss. Her home, when she returned to our province with her husband Dick from Montreal, was Halifax, and all of Halifax feels that loss. But we know from having lived through it just this past year that all Nova Scotians together feel the loss of someone who made such a great contribution to our province as Ruth Goldblum. Another example of how when one family loses a member of their family, that we all feel it. Doreen Lewis, another example. I had the great privilege of working with Doreen on a number of community initiatives, including serving together on the board of Neptune Theatre. Doreen's contribution to Annapolis, to her area of the province, is well known. It was historic, and I'm proud that Nova Scotia boasts the town with the first African Nova Scotian mayor, first African Nova Scotian female mayor. But her contribution spreads to all Nova Scotia. And her loss, again, a loss for her family, a loss for her hometown, is also a loss for all of us. Paul Comeau from Clare, who I only got to know in the last 2 years, so dedicated to the Acadian community, so entrenched in Acadian history, so proud to be an Acadian, Nova Scotian. And by the way, a very, very good cook, as anyone who's been to his restaurant will remember. And on the lighter side, the loss that we feel, that home that he turned into a restaurant that still remained a home, closed with his passing. And when it closed, not only did his family suffer a loss, not only did his community, Clare and the Acadian community, suffer a loss, but all Nova Scotia suffered a loss, and I feel very privileged to have gotten to know him just in the last years of his life. Madam Speaker, Pat Connolly from our sporting heritage fits into that category. From now on, generations of Nova Scotians are going to go to the Halifax Metro Centre to watch a hockey game or a basketball game or any event, and they're going to see the Pat Connolly Sportscasters box. And I hope for years and years to come they'll know why it's called that. Because for Nova Scotians who grew up here, who follow sports here, for the last number of generations in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and up to this year, they knew the contribution that Pat Connolly made to telling the sporting story of Nova Scotia in its many forms. We all share in that loss together. So, Madam Speaker, in the spirit of coming together as a Nova Scotia family, I am very pleased that the government included those individuals and many others equally deserving who I would like to talk about but didn't get to know personally, who we all lost as a Nova Scotia family in the last year. And so to see the government recognize them in this way, recognize the loss of our fishing communities like Woods Harbor, and set aside a day of remembrance, I think it's an appropriate thing. And I know when that bill comes forward, we'll be right there to help the government pass it. And so Nova Scotians can have a way of remembering for all time the people who have come before. Now, Madam Speaker, I do want to go on for a moment and reflect on what the throne speech means to my own constituency of Cumberland South. Madam Speaker, as some members in the House, hopefully all members in the House know, but certainly as my fellow seatmate from Cumberland County, the member for Cumberland North knows, and I know the member for Timberley Prospect has a history in Cumberland County, and there are others know. It is a beautiful part of our province. It's a constituency, by the way, that's been touched by its own tragedies throughout its history, as all Nova Scotians know. It's, I mentioned the fishing communities, but throughout time it's also been a heavy industrial area, and certainly is most well known for its mining history. And Madam Speaker, the people of Spring Hill, in particular, remember well the mining disasters throughout, the many mining disasters throughout their town's history. And I know that we pause and remember the more recent ones, the fire of '56, the bump of '58 here in this House, and appropriately so. They remain among the largest workplace accidents in the history of our province. And I am proud to have met the remaining surviving miners from those disasters. Herb Peppernell, for example, I've mentioned this House before, was trapped for 9.5 days during the bump of '58, and tells the story to this day of how he and his fellow miners who were survivors managed through 9.5 days underground. Dr. Arnold Burden, who is very active to this day, was one of the first to go underground with the dragermen as a doctor to look for survivors and to treat them and bring them to the surface. This is a history that the people of Spring Hill share, but it's a history that all Nova Scotians share as we pause from time to time and reflect on this great Nova Scotia family. But, Madam Speaker, when I compare the lofty promises made in the throne speech to the needs and the reality of Cumberland County, I have to tell you I am very disappointed that the government has nothing worthwhile to say to the people of Cumberland County that will make a difference in their lives. Madam Speaker, we have a government that insists that it wants to do something good for our kids in schools and education. But I can run down the list of schools in Cumberland County that are either in disrepair or in threat of closure or have had expansion plans cancelled because of the squeeze that the NDP have put on our school board. Just yesterday, I raised in this House the sad story of the reconstruction of River Hibbert District High School, a commitment 4 years old with the funding in place. Commitment and funding made by my predecessor, Mr. Murray Scott, the former member from Cumberland South, who I have the great honor of succeeding, whose projects like that one I intend to see through, regardless of where the resistance comes from in the NDP or in the school board, as the case may be for River Hibbert residents. Madam Speaker, there is a school, primary to 12, coming together, an economically vital piece of the community of River Hibbert, Joggins and area, with the funding already in the budget, half done when the hammer came down and the work stopped. It is not right, Madam Speaker, that we have Nova Scotia students crawling over a construction zone to get into a half-finished school, where the tiles on the floor are all curled up from the mildew and the dampness and the moisture, and literally the snow that comes into the school when it's snowing, with a gym that's as old as time itself. What message is the government sending to the students of River Hibbert when they allow them to go to a school in that kind of disrepair, particularly when we know the funding is in place to finish the job? And Madam Speaker, there's nothing in the throne speech, particularly about education, that the people of River Hibbert, Joggins and area can rely on when they look to their government to finish that school. Madam Speaker, I worked through the school closure process with my constituents in Wentworth, with the Wentworth Consolidated School. If there's ever an example of how broken the school review process is, it is on living display in the community of Wentworth Valley, where they have a school with a stable enrollment. And actually, the projection shows a slight growth in enrollment in the coming years, with a teacher-to-student ratio the same as any other school in the province, with a centerpiece building for the people of the Wentworth Valley to build their local economy around. Forced to the brink of closure to save a few $100,000. And the burden of proof fell to the parents and the residents of the Wentworth Valley, up against hundreds of pages of reports prepared by high-priced consultants that were actually riddled with errors. And when the parents were able to successfully poke holes in those reports, they were held back and frustrated as they tried to make their point. When they asked the school board and the Department of Education itself for information about the state of the school, like its roof and so on, they were told, no, they can't have that information. I personally had to fall back to a Freedom of Information request to try and get the community the information it needed to counter the faulty report of the consultant that the school board had hired. And Madam Speaker, even that wasn't enough. Parents spent hundreds of hours working to keep their school open. Now, Madam Speaker, I understand that the school board's money is for education. What gets missed is it's not for bureaucracy, it's for schools and classrooms and kids. And when we tell the school board that we need that school to kickstart our community's economy, I understand why the school board would say, we're here to run schools. We're not the Department of Economic Development. Well, Madam Speaker, as we know in the Wentworth Valley, and as I know many other rural communities are now seen in living color who face the same situation, it is about time that the left hand of government and the right hand of government knew what each other were doing and worked together. Because on the one hand, the NDP have created this commission on the rural economy to go out and gather good ideas about how to kickstart our rural economy. And I'm glad they did, and I have met with that commission, and I've given them my own thoughts, and I've encouraged them to get whatever they need from us or from anyone else to put together a good plan. We all want that. But, Madam Speaker, anyone who has thought about how to run a 21st century economy is going to tell you that one of the cornerstones is a modern, decent 21st century education for our kids. And so, how crazy is it that on the one hand we have a government with a commission looking for ideas to kickstart our small rural community economies, and on the other hand, they're forcing the school boards to close schools in those same communities. That is an example of the right hand and the left hand of the NDP government not knowing what each other is doing. And only strong leadership can bring all of the hands of government together in one coherent whole. And that is sorely missing, and is the communities of Bass River, of Wentworth, of Hebville, of many other small communities across our province that are suffering because there is no vision in this throne speech. There is no plan to kickstart our rural economy in this throne speech, and there is no thought to education other than cut, squeeze, less, and in all the wrong places, by the way, which is at the small school level. You know, the government goes out of its way to point out that enrollment is declining. Of course it's declining. Goes out of its way to count up the square footage in those small rural schools. Goes out of its way to produce graphs that show funding going up and enrollment going down, Madam Speaker. But what they miss is that whether you're in downtown Halifax or whether you're in Wentworth or River Hibbert, many other places, the teacher-student ratios don't vary that much. And when you look at it that way, you realize that it should not matter where you live in this province, you deserve a decent, fair public education. That's what's been lost in the last few years under the NDP. And certainly for the people of Cumberland South, there is nothing in this throne speech to show them anything different. Mr. Speaker, there's very little for seniors in this throne speech. The government has halted the long-term plans to create enough advanced care, long-term care beds for the needs of our growing population of seniors who need a higher level of care. They have said that the answer is home care. And of course, where that is available, where that is possible, where it can be done, that is part of the answer. That for our seniors who are able to and want to, we should stand by them so they can age in place in their own homes. But Madam Speaker, today in Nova Scotia, the wait list for long-term care from seniors who need it, who have been assessed as needing it, is higher than it's ever been in our history. 2,500 seniors are waiting for long-term care. Of that list, 1/3 are seniors who live in a part of the province where there is no home care available for them. They are doing what they need to do to get the care they need with no help from the NDP. Another 1/3 of that list are seniors who are actually in our hospitals, in our acute care facilities, waiting for a long-term care bed. Well, I see some members laughing at that fact. I would invite them to visit the Sutherland Harris Hospital in Tatamagouche, which I did just recently. And they will tell you, Madam Speaker, in that 22-bed hospital, that there have been times this year where every single bed was occupied not by someone in need of acute care, but by a senior not admitted, just needing a bed and care until they got into long-term care, which surely at some point the government is going to learn is the least appropriate care at the most expensive price, when what they really need is long-term care. In Cumberland South, in the community of Advocate, they've been waiting for 2 more beds, just 2, for 4 years. The government came into office and they halted the call for tenders to construct those 2 beds. There are many residents of the Advocate area who have gone through the single entry access system for assessment, level 1, level 2, who need long-term care. And yet, in that community, they're still waiting. Those 2 add to that long-term care waiting list, Madam Speaker. And it is not right. They don't just want to age in place, they want to age in their own community. And for the cost of 2 beds, they've been said no. They've been told no. Well, Madam Speaker, part of the financial tragedy of all this is that the community actually did their part. They raised a lot of money, sold real property, put the money in an account to help contribute to the cost of building those beds. They just need a government that will work with them to get it done, but that's not happening. And there's nothing in this throne speech for the senior citizens of Cumberland South, particularly those that need advanced level care. Madam Speaker, not just for Cumberland South, but for all Nova Scotia, I do want to point out the good chuckle that the government gave us in the throne speech the other day when they veered off into virtual reality. A little detour into the virtual world. When the throne speech talking about NDP promises says they've virtually been kept. Well, I don't know if their platform was recorded on an Xbox 360 or some other kind of virtual gaming system, but Madam Speaker, that's got to be one of the funniest lines in a throne speech yet recorded. I don't know what kind of virtual reality that statement came from, because in the real Nova Scotia, voters remember the actual promises of the NDP. Balance the budget and keep it balanced. First year. No tax increases. Control government spending. Keep our ERs open 24/7. The Premier, all his ministers, all the MLAs on the government side, they ran on those commitments. So to stand up now and say, well, we've virtually kept them, is actually an insult to the people of Nova Scotia. And actually, while I'm on it, Mr. Speaker, or Madam Speaker, excuse me, there's something I want to table, because like every government before, the NDP like to use the same old excuse that they didn't realize how bad it was financially when they got in. What a sad excuse to use, Madam Speaker. Nova Scotians have heard that one too many times before. But I'm glad there's one honest member of the government over there when it comes to describing the finances of the province before the NDP came in, because I did read with great interest a letter to the editor in the Globe and Mail just last month about the finances of Nova Scotia. Madam Speaker, I actually hope the Premier reads it at some point, because he might change his sorry excuses about why he can't keep his promises except in the virtual world. Because this letter to the editor was written in response to an attack on Nova Scotia by one of our own Liberal members of Parliament, Mr. Bryson, who went out of his way in Toronto to describe our province in very negative terms. Something I would never encourage another Nova Scotian to do, by the way. It's okay for us to debate in this House the state of the province. It's okay to do that. It's okay to debate in our kitchens and in our family rooms about the state of the province. As my dad used to say, when you're in Pictou County, you're from Pictou, or you're from Glasgow, you can fight like cats and dogs, but the minute you go over Mount Tom, you're all Pictou County residents. Well, the minute you cross the border, we're all Nova Scotians. And so I was disappointed to see that Liberal MP take such a hard shot at our province when he was out of province. But that's not really the point, Madam Speaker. The point is that there was a very determined Nova Scotian who wanted to defend our province's financial record, who wrote a letter to the Globe and Mail talking about the state of our province's finances. And I'll quote from it, and then I'll table it for all members to see. But this person wrote that Nova Scotia's financial condition has actually greatly improved over the past decade. Well, I think it's about time someone pointed that out, and I'm glad that this person did. In fact, they write, the three deficits during the past decade have each been under 1% of GDP. Now, what I find interesting about that, Madam Speaker, is that in the past 10 years, it's true that there have only been three deficits. The three most recent ones, the three NDP ones, that the 7 before that, obviously the writer of this letter believes were balanced. And I'm going to table it right now. But I just want to make clear for all members that the author of this letter is none other than the current Minister of Finance for our province, the member for Halifax Needham. So I do want to take a moment and thank her for correcting the record, correcting the Premier's virtual storyline, that in fact 7 surpluses followed by 3 NDP deficits, and that our position actually improved over the last 10 years. So I will table that, and I know the member for Halifax Fairview is quite anxious to have a copy, and I'd like her to.
Let it pour.
You see, Madam Speaker, the government's record is all wet, and that's the point I'm trying to make. In any event, just while I'm here, there is actually another honest member of the government over there, at least when it comes to the past. Maybe not the budget just ended, but at least when it comes to the past. Because I heard the Premier say, again, wrongly yesterday, that the NDP had inherited a big deficit when they came into office. In fact, I've seen their TV ads where he makes the same claim. Well, Madam Speaker, I happen to have the message from the Minister for the public accounts, the audited financial statements of the government for the year that the NDP came in. And what's interesting is, and I'll read it and then I'll table it, it says the public accounts for the year ended March 31st, 2009 reported a surplus of $19,700,000. Well, Madam Speaker, that's the very first sentence of the message from the Minister. Now, what happened was after the year had ended, and before the Minister was required to sign this confirmation of a surplus, the government did change, and there was a new Minister of Finance. So the Minister of Finance, who actually affixed his signature to this message that says there was a surplus, is the previous Minister of Finance and the still member for Halifax Fairview, and so I will table that. They're getting quite a pile of these, I know, on the table, but I think it's important that all members know that. Now, Madam Speaker, while I'm in the habit of tabling things, I know we've been down this road before. Of course, the government claims they inherited a surplus. We prove over and over again, using the minister's own words, that they didn't. So they changed the line. This is where we do get into the virtual world, Madam Speaker, that the throne speech talked about. They changed their line. When we catch them, they don't say it was a deficit. They made something up. They say, okay, it was a structural deficit, as if there's any such thing. You know, Madam Speaker, there's a whole set of rules called generally accepted accounting principles. Everything is defined in them. You're not going to find the term structural deficit there. Nope. But what's more interesting, Madam Speaker, is that the Auditor General has actually weighed in on this recently. And I have the page, the relevant page from the Auditor General's most recent report, which I will table in the hope that facts will actually trump virtual reality someday with this government. And what the Auditor General says is that the following exhibit, and he has a graph of all the surpluses and recent deficits, shows the fluctuation in Nova Scotia's results over the past 5 years and does not indicate the existence of a structural deficit. The Auditor General ruled out any kind of structural deficit himself. Made up. They'll have to come up with a whole new term. Maybe that's maybe a virtual deficit, as they have to shift their line yet again. Madam Speaker, on this same page, which I am about to table, the Auditor General also reports the province of Nova Scotia has incurred a surplus in 8 of the past 10 years. Guess which 2 were not in surplus? The most recent 2 under the NDP. These are the words of the Auditor General. I'll be happy to table that. And I just think it's important, Madam Speaker, that on the table should be all the documentation to refute this virtual world that the NDP live in and that they advertise in, so that Nova Scotians know for themselves that we have a government that came into office with a balanced budget, promising to keep it balanced and then didn't, promising not to raise taxes and then did, complained about power rates but then made them far worse. That's the virtual reality that the throne speech should have talked about. But I can even go on, Madam Speaker. We counted up, Madam Speaker, the number of times the government attempted to pat itself on the back for all the things that it's done to Nova Scotia over the past almost 4 years now. I'm sure there's a sprain over there somewhere, a tennis elbow or something, from patting themselves on the back. 25 examples in a 17-page throne speech of a government attempting to pat itself on the back. Well, Madam Speaker, the throne speech also has 25 pretty glaring holes in it of things the government did to Nova Scotia in the past 4 years that they chose not to talk about in their throne speech this week. Number one, very importantly, the throne speech neglected to mention that 6,400 Nova Scotians lost their job in the last year, 5,400 of them in the South Shore alone. That the unemployment rate on Cape Breton Island is 17.5%, that there are some communities in Cape Breton where it's 30% or more. And all those numbers are up from before they came into office. And for a government that likes to blame the worldwide recession, that somehow it's Greece's fault, or Cyprus's fault, or Italy's fault, or Spain's fault, or someone else's fault, anybody's fault but theirs. The fact is that they neglected to mention at the same time that the NDP lost 6,400 jobs, the rest of Canada gained 689,000 jobs.
Go figure.
9 provinces went up. 1 province went down. That was not in the throne speech, Madam Speaker, but that is exactly what the government should be spending its time and energy on, is fixing that, of turning around our economy, of kickstarting the economy of Nova Scotia, instead of living in a world of virtual reality. Madam Speaker,
Get there.
no deficit coming in fact a surplus. The NDP threw the books into deficit, which is why no one is confident that it'll truly be balanced next week, in addition to the $27 million. They're also getting more money from Ottawa than ever before in our province's history. $578 million more dollars in transfers to Nova Scotia now than 5 years ago. Yep. More money from Ottawa, borrowing all kinds of money, and by raising the HST, by raising our taxes after promising not to.
It dispelled all the lies, you know? The what? The mistruths.
You know, Madam Speaker, I hear people yelling, EI, EI. You know what would be great? A government that actually created jobs in Nova Scotia and focused on making real opportunities for people.
That's right.
Instead of playing political games like they are. Madam Speaker, more money than ever before from Ottawa. $1 billion more in HST that they've collected, and $1.4 billion more in borrowing, and they still can't balance the budget.
Alfie will come after you to do that.
I can't believe they would claim that they're happy with their financial record. With all that extra money coming in HST and in transfers from Ottawa and borrowing, and they still can't balance the budget.
Can't do it. Can't figure it out.
And when they find a mistake in their budget, they try and hide that too. It's another $27 million, all that ends up in more debt, all that ends up in more bills being handed on to our children to pay, Madam Speaker. In fact, I got this insert in the Halifax Herald the other day, the Herald magazine. And there was a little baby Nova Scotia, I think it was a boy, but I didn't look closely enough to be sure, but I think it was a boy, crying, with the headline that on his birth, he was already, he or she, $14,008 in provincial debt. A lot of that has been piled up, Madam Speaker, in the last 4 short years. And so, when we have a government that has a $27 million hole in their budget and won't fix it and won't even tell us about it, what they lose sight of is that $27 million, that bill is passed on to that child, to that baby, and every other Nova Scotian like him or her. That's why it's wrong to cover those things up, Madam Speaker, because they're the ones that pay. Now, Madam Speaker, we have this commission now going around studying how to kickstart the economy. Well, thankfully we do, Madam Speaker, because clearly the government, the ones that people elected to manage the economy, they have no ideas about how to manage the economy or create jobs. They lost jobs while the rest of Canada was moving ahead. And if you look outside Halifax, Madam Speaker, this province actually has its own homegrown recession now, because the economy of rural Nova Scotia actually shrank last year, the very definition of a recession. The economy shrank by 0.3% in 2012. That happened alone under the NDP, alone here in Nova Scotia, alone in rural Nova Scotia, an outright recession. So they don't have to blame Greece or Cyprus or Europe. They've done their own job on the economy of rural Nova Scotia here at home, Madam Speaker, an outright shrinkage. Outright shrinkage.
You're embarrassing.
So, you know what, Madam Speaker? Nova Scotians,
you just can't stop. Huh?
Nova Scotians are voting with their feet. They're voting with their feet. That's why we actually had record out-migration.
Are you going to work as a paramedic when they go on strike? When the paramedics go out, are you going to go on? Work
Order, please. The Honourable Leader for the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's because of this record of economic mismanagement that causes our economy to shrink while the rest of Canada grows ahead that Nova Scotians are voting with their feet. Why thousands and thousands of our fellow citizens are working in places like Calgary and Fort McMurray and Toronto and other places. Not a single one of them would do that if there was a job for them here at home. Not a single family would choose to spend so much time apart if there was a job for them here at home. Not a single hockey team or Boy Scout troop or Girl Guide troop would go without a leader if those parents had a job here at home. Now, Mr. Speaker, the throne speech has nothing to say to those people. In fact, one of the biggest glaring holes of all is how little there is about the most important issue of our time, how to kickstart the economy of the province and get Nova Scotia growing, all parts of Nova Scotia growing again. And even though they had the shipyard contract land in their laps, and even though they had the offshore exploration start up again and land in their laps, their only response was to run TV ads taking credit for it instead of actually figuring out how to get Nova Scotians working and participating in those opportunities. You either know how to run TV ads and take credit for things, or you know how to actually build a modern 21st century economy and provide opportunities for people, and they have shown which side they're on. And in a few moments, I will talk about which side we're on, which is clearly to spend our resources on actually creating those opportunities for all Nova Scotians instead of taking credit for them. Madam Speaker, the components of a modern 21st century education or economy surely
Before you get started, you want to allow it?
I'll just pause for a moment, Madam Speaker. I understand there's an important introduction. I'm happy to yield for that.
Thank you. The Honourable Member for Halifax-Clayton Park on an introduction.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party for allowing me to interrupt his reply to the speech from the throne. I wanted to draw the members' attention to the West Gallery, which is not very crowded right now, but we have a very important guest from Halifax-Clayton Park, and his name is Stuart Whalen, and he is my son from the area, and he's very seldom ever come to the house, so I'm very pleased. I'd like you to give him a warm welcome, please. Thank you very much.
We welcome all of our guests for today's proceedings. The Honourable Leader for the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I am delighted to see the son of the member for Halifax-Clayton Park here, and would like to welcome him on behalf of the Progressive Conservative Caucus as well. Talk to him later about the YPCs and see if we have a chance with him. Madam Speaker, the components of a modern 21st century economy to make it grow are self-evident to us, but clearly lost on the government and the Liberals too, now that I think about it. But the components of growing an economy today include lower taxes for everyone, affordable power, frozen power rates for everyone, no special deals. They include stopping wasteful government spending and directing our resources to important frontline services. And in order to build a successful modern economy, you need a 21st century world-class public education system. The very thing that they have cut is not only a right of all young Nova Scotians, but an important part of building a modern economy. And so, Madam Speaker, how crazy is it that in a time of declining enrollment, that there were still so many young Nova Scotian students in grades primary, 1, 2, and 3, our earliest grades, going to school in classes with 30 or more kids in them this past September? That takes a special kind of mismanagement in a time of declining enrollment to pull that off. But that's what happened, Madam Speaker, this past September, and hopefully will not reoccur, but there's nothing in the throne speech to tell Nova Scotians we won't see another example of that when the school year gets underway again next September. Madam Speaker, I spoke a moment ago about the community schools in my riding, but the same is true of the small rural community schools in many parts of Nova Scotia that find themselves on a school review list, that find themselves being closed as recently as last night or in the upcoming year. And Madam Speaker, the throne speech is silent on the process that allows these things to happen. The process of reviewing these schools is broken. It doesn't take into account the economic needs of those communities who need a school at the heart of the community to kickstart that economy and start growing the local area again. A government that sees these problems would actually say in the throne speech are going to change that process. But that's not what they say. Their silence speaks volumes, Madam Speaker. And in our hospitals, where budgets are limited, where there's no new money for health, we already know that, they continue to support 10 health authorities and 10 CEOs and dozens of vice presidents and hundreds of managers and thousands of directors, while important services go on. You know, you walk into an emergency room in Nova Scotia today, Madam Speaker, you may not see a doctor, but you are definitely going to trip over a vice president or two on your way in the door. They have made their priorities for health care funding very clear, which is all of those administrators sitting in offices and not in ERs. But Madam Speaker, Nova Scotians have seen that. What they now know is that the Minister of Education and his government believe that giving money to Tim Hortons outlets in our hospitals is in some twisted way spending on health care. And we've raised this before, that in the Tim Hortons here at the Capital Health District, the government directs them to spend $1,400,000 a year subsidizing those Tim Hortons. They tell them to do it. Even the executives of Capital Health have said, we don't want to spend that money there anymore. We would rather spend it on important services. And they put that in their business plan 4 years in a row. And 4 years in a row, the Minister of Health has said, no, you have to keep spending that money on Tim Hortons, and we will count it as part of health spending. Well, it is not health spending. It is a subsidy of coffee, of all things, Madam Speaker, of Tim Hortons coffee. And they lose $1,400,000 a year doing it, Madam Speaker. So the time has come to cut the Tim Hortons coffee off altogether, cut the subsidy off altogether. Don't call that health care spending. It is not health care spending. And redirect that money into something useful. We have made the suggestion that that money, it could actually buy an insulin pump for every single Nova Scotian child that needs one, who has diabetes and could benefit from an insulin pump. Hear, hear. Hear, hear. And I will say that we're all getting the hint. We're all getting the hint from the throne speech that there may be something coming, Madam Speaker. And I sure hope that's true, because spending money on Tim Hortons when we could be spending it on insulin pumps is pretty important. You know, Madam Speaker, there are political parties out there that call on the government to spend money on things over and over and over, but never point out how they would pay for it. The Liberal Party of Nova Scotia would be an example of that. Spend, spend, spend. Say you want a balance. Say you're willing to make the tough decisions, but don't actually do it. Spend and spend. And when it comes to these insulin pumps, where we are different than the Liberals and the NDP is we actually found the money to pay for those insulin pumps. That's a test of whether you can govern or not. We actually found the money, and they didn't, and neither have they, but I hope they do. I hope they do. So if that's the hint of what's to come, that's good, and I hope they live up to it. Madam Speaker, yesterday, the government actually played a pretty bad sleight of hand on our small businesses.
Well, she wanted that.
No, carry on.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yesterday, the government played a very sad sleight of hand with our small businesses. They felt free to announce they were reducing the small business tax by 0.5%, but left out the little detail that the threshold to qualify for it was going to be smaller. In their own announcement, they said they were cutting the tax, but it wouldn't cost the government anything. Well, that can only be true if they're giving with one hand and taking with the other.
That's right.
And, Madam Speaker, the same is true with their announcement that they want to create 5 doors for business. The problem, Madam Speaker, as we learned from that old show, Let's Make a Deal, is you never know what's behind door number 1.
They're all locked. They're all locked.
But what we do know in the case of Nova Scotia is when we have a business wanting to expand here, or wanting to open, or wanting to locate here, when they do open that surprise door number 1, what they find is the highest power rates and the highest taxes and a whole lot of regulation and administrative penalties and other things that get in their way. Now, Madam Speaker, that is not going to help turn the economy of rural Nova Scotia around. And today's announcement about user fees is not going to help either, because it got a little bit more expensive this week, to live and work in Nova Scotia. And the government's defense that the user fees are going up by the amount of inflation is laughable when we know that inflation is the highest in all of Canada here because of what they have done to our power rates, what they have done to our taxes, what they have done to the cost of everyday items, up and up and up, and then to use that as justification for also hiking our user fees is clear evidence to Nova Scotians why it's very expensive under an NDP government. And no one knows better than the people of Cumberland County the impact of user fees on the local economy, because it is there that the Liberals put that toll highway in, and not a single Liberal has been elected in Cumberland County since, and won't be for a long time. And I hope that the NDP get the message that the risk that they're taking because of the record of the Liberals in that part of the province. And with those few words, Madam Speaker, I will adjourn debate for today.
There's a motion to adjourn debate for address and reply. All in favour say aye. Those opposed, nay. The motion is carried. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I understand it's been agreed today to dispense with the previously announced late debate proceedings under Rule 5. Agreed?
Is it agreed? Agreed.
So, Madam Speaker, I wish we do now rise to meet from the hours of 2 to 6 p.m. on Tuesday next. After daily routine and question period, we will be again doing address and reply, and if time permits, we'll do government bills for second reading, bill number 3. So I wish we do now rise to meet from the hours of 2 till 6 on April 2nd. Thank you.
The motion is that we do now rise to meet again between the hours of 2 and 6 p.m. on Tuesday, April the 2nd. All in favour say aye. Those opposed, nay. The motion is carried.